Hello, everyone. As part of the seminars of American Studies Association of Turkey, we are today welcoming Professor Saloua Karoui Elounelli, Professor of English at l'École Normale Supérieure, University of Tunis, right? And let me introduce you first. Contributed to journals and edited collections with articles and chapters on poetics of experimental literature and on the theory of narrative fiction. Published in journals such as Mosaic Journal for the Disciplinary Study of Literature, Texte, Cashier's Narratology, American, British, Canadian Studies, and more recently in Arizona Quarterly and The Comparatist. And she also contributed to edited collections on American experimental fiction, on the poetics of genre, on parody in American fiction. And she was a guest editor for a special issue of Studies in the Literary Imagination on the trope of the mirror in contemporary experimental literature. Published in April 2023. She also contributed with an essay to that issue on American modernist metafiction through the Unlooking Glass, Cartesian Sonata by W. Gass, and Whittle Jacket by J. Hawkes. And she also translated 2 books into Arabic from English, States and Women's Rights, The Making of Post-Colonial Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco by Munira Charat. And from French, she translated Roland Barthes, right? And she has many publications. And they're very long. So I'm leaving the ground to you. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all the members and the president of the Association of American Studies of Turkey. I'm glad to share this work. Actually, this is more of or less a work in progress. I worked on the question of authorship in some 20th century and the metafictional texts, specifically in past years, and now I'm going back to it in light partly of my teaching of a theory class and of literature class, and in light also of other thematic axis of my personal research. So I'm trying to bring together actually a condensed picture of questions, more questions, of course, than answers, and more remarks, of course, than assertive statements with regard then to the issue of authorship or the conceptualizing of authorship in both in theory. Now, I have to share this with you. Yes, I mean, what I'm going to do or try to do today in this presentation then is to actually sum up the major tendencies in the discourse, in the American discourse of literary criticism, literary theory on the one hand, and in 2 instances of experimental metafiction, because this is the area I'm interested in, and to see how the concept of authorship has in fact been theorized and continuously debated. And for the students in particular, it's very important that you grasp as well the fact that the real starting point or the point at which I'm going to take on the discussion around authorship relates to after the death of the author. So after the, that famous formulation or provocative formulation, together with the also the variations on it, the variations on Roland Barthes' notion of the death of the author that other post-structuralist theorists and critics produced. To start, I mean, my introduction actually is a way of, or an attempt to give you a small overview of the context, the Western theoretical context with regard to authorship. And I picked up actually three major authors or figures to illustrate, of course, globally, the direction that the theorizing of authorship was taking right from the beginning of the 20th century. And this is why I opted for Henry Bergson as a first instance, because Bergson, together with also the modernists who were very much influenced and inspired by him, revived the conception of theory within the cult of the new, that an author has to be necessarily associated with the possibility of bringing something new. So innovation, as of course the term also for originality. So Bergson actually formulated what was felt by the modernists as a kind of compulsion to bring up something new. But it was not only simply a compulsion, it was more also a question of anguish. The question of, or a feeling of anguish that animated them as well. And this is what Harold Bloom in The Anxiety of Influence in the 70s tried as well to explain and to sum up. So that anguish, which 20th century writers started to feel and to experience with regard to originality, in fact. And its main cause, of course, was the fact that by the time we reached the 20th century, the human and probably the Western canon has already been, overwhelmed with all forms, all types of formal and thematic and conceptual and stylistic innovation. And the 20th century writer had to struggle against the, intimidating impact or presence also of those classics. But, that maybe a positive or even utopian appeal and celebration of the new, of newness that Henry Bergson, tried to present in simple and problematical terms did not last for long, because we see as we progress in the 20th century, critics and theorists started to rethink authorship even before that is Roland Barthes' Death of the Author. We see some of the most prominent critics started already defining the position of the author in the process of writing in terms of absence and even in terms of effacement. Here comes the second quote from Maurice Blanchot, the French critic, in his work published in the mid-50s, donc Literary Space. He defines literary space as that entity, so it's not the text, it's the space of literariness. Donc it is that area, that space that comes into being only through the banishment of its author. Right, so he was the first actually to highlight this idea of exile, of banishment of the author from the area, from what he actually produces. And his major argument, Maurice Blanchot's major argument, was that the literary space has to come into being at the expense of its own author, and necessarily through the banishment of the authorial voice. Now, at the same time as Roland Barthes, formulated in his rather provocative terms the death of the author, and I will come to that later on because he did that not in a vacuum. Roland Barthes, in the essay about the death of the author, of course, he justifies this claim by the importance of intertextuality, by the fact that literary writing is always doomed in a way to be a rewriting. So there is always rewriting that guides literary creativity. And so textuality is necessarily intertextual. Hence, for him, then what brings the literariness of the text to the surface is the act of interpretation and not exactly the act of writing. And Roland Barthes in particular challenged in a very emphatic way, he challenged the myth or the mythology of originality, right? By highlighting and insisting on the fact that textuality is always and already intertextual. Now, I will come to intertextuality later on, because the way it was also debated by later theories, by later critics and theorists, that is later than Roland Barthes, contributed in a very significant way also to this banishment of the authorial authority, or the undermining or the challenging of the authorial authority in our experience of literariness as readers. But before that, it's important to stop at another contemporary work by Michel Foucault, which is What is an Author? Actually, it was initially a conference he gave at the Collège de France, and then I think he revisited it, and it was published, I think in 1979, if I'm not wrong. What is important in Foucault's What is an Author is that he promoted the notion of the author function, and the author function being that construct that we formulate, or we also we create and we abide by in our interpretation. Donc, what Foucault described as the author function also did not really deviate in any radical way from the death of the author, but it was maybe more positive in highlighting how the authorial voice or image is what one constructs in the process of interpretation. The moment one then, in the moment of interpretation, one delimits the scope of meaningfulness of the text, then the reader, or that interpretive moment, then in a way creates or shapes what is called the author function. Right. Now, to come more closely to the American context, because this is what we are interested in, of course, as also part of the association or the community of researchers in American studies. Now, when it comes to the American critical and theoretical traditions, I prefer to start with Wayne Booth, even though his important contribution in 1961 in the rhetoric of fiction was recognized only much later, in fact, or even those who, even the criticism criticism, that literary criticism, that relied on his ideas or on his insightful hypotheses, most of the time did not pay much attention to a major, invention or, addition that he brought, conceptually speaking, which is that of the implied author. Donc, either critics did not pay much attention to this, or they perceived it as in unproblematical terms. Now, Booth became even more interesting, and in particular, his category of the implied author became more interesting with the rise of the area of narratology And in particular, when narratology moved on from the classical phase to the post-classical phase. So from the years 2000 on, and even the late 1990s, we see a number of theories, often associated with narratology, totally or partially, who would then bring back the question of authorship and would start with Booth's category of the implied author. Of course, they do not always agree with his identification of the implied author, but it's very significant that they almost all of them saw that it is important for any debate, for any reconsideration or rethinking of the authorial concept, especially the implied author, to start with then the pioneering work of Wayne Booth. Now, what made his category quite significant, as I said, especially when it was rediscovered in the late 90s, and it had to wait for a few decades actually to be fruitfully examined, explored, debated, and so on. It had the merit, the category created by Booth, of course, to function at the intersection of pure formalism or structuralism and historicism. Also, in creating the implied author, now when you go to the rhetoric of fiction, you see that he mostly used the category to solve the question of reliability, of narrators' reliability. What allows us to say, so mainly in relation to narrative fiction, what allows one to say that a narrator is reliable or unreliable? What is the criteria? What is the point of reference? And here Booth tells us that a narrator is to be or can be judged as unreliable when his statements or claims differ and are in contradiction to those of the implied author. So by implied author, he meant then that structure embedded in the narrative, that structure of serious messages or norms or standards that the text actually means, that the text presents to its reader as its serious content. At another moment in the rhetoric of fiction, he refers even to the implied author as the second self of the author. So it's not the author as the historical being who is an author of this book, but author of other books, who has other parts of his life, other facets of his identity. We are not interested in that historical figure, but what matters to our experience of literariness and textuality is that second self, according to him, which we detect inside the narrative. Of course, very briefly, the debate, especially the very recent debate around this, tended to highlight the fact that when identifying the implied author as the real author's second self, we are taken back to the abortive and almost absurd idea of authorial intention. Right? Because authority, traditionally speaking, the authority of the author used to be grounded in that claim or that myth that when we read literature, a successful reading, successful interpretation would allow us to meet exactly what the author had in mind. But then with the development of the philosophy of language, etc., we came to see that, of course, there is no way to check an authorial. This is why the question is abortive, to check an author's intention, even when the author is still alive. And probably the best illustration of this is how when now prominent writers give interviews, Sometimes, the scholar who would interview the writer would seek a kind of explanation, but the author would produce even more misleading or confusing comment on his or her own book. Donc, this is a good illustration, I think, of the fact that there is no way to grasp, not only no way to grasp intention, but also the discursive structure that we receive as readers of literature need not correspond to what is supposed to be the authorial intention. Donc, when Booth then discussed the implied author, or tried to simplify it by linking it to the author's second self, here, of course, there was a lot of debate, of course, in opposition to his idea, and they perceived in it a form of pointless argument about grasping the author's intention. And yet the category, has been reinvigorated by recent critics. Reinvigorated, why? Because it allows our reading to be purposeful, to function against what we assume to be the text's serious message or the text's normative voice. Except that, what makes it also, significant is that we do find in many parodic texts, very good illustrations of the fact that a text can have different implied authors in different times. From the moment then we accept that the implied author is a readerly construct, we construct in the reading process the implied author. So, the same text can have different implied authors. And I always have in mind, when I think of this, the famous example of Robinson Crusoe. Now, after a parodic repetition of Robinson Crusoe, such as Fou, by John Maxwell Coetzee, the South African Coetzee, in light of Coetzee's parodic subversion and parodic also unveiling of the imperialist frame of mind in a novel of adventure like Robinson Crusoe. Now, when we go back and reread Robinson Crusoe in light of Coetzee, we would certainly come up with a different implied author, different from the probably more innocent or more naive or more down-to-earth reader of, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago. Right. Apart from Booth now, this is why in the subtitle, if you remember, I said Shahrazad or Orpheus. Actually, I'm very much interested also in two major tendencies in the theoretical and the critical discourse, two tendencies that are condensed, in fact, in two voices. One was a professional critic and one of the major theorists and critics of the American novel, of American fiction, and in particular of postmodern metafiction, Ihab Hassan. And the second is a fiction writer, John Barth, fiction writer, but also one who tried to theorize the possibility of authorship in the late 20th century, or by the time we come to realize that originality is simply impossible, that every author knows from the start that he's going to repeat someone else, or he's going to repeat even many other writers, that he's going to, whether he knows it or not, to also imitate characters, themes, stylistic, rhetorical devices that have already been used. Donc, the two have this common, Ihab Hassan, like John Barth, this common then diagnosis or understanding of the literary scene, especially starting from the mid-20th century on. Now, Ihab Hassan developed in many of his writings, but I'm referring to two works in particular, the dismemberment of Orpheus, the one from which I took the first quote, and the second quote. In the dismemberment of Orpheus, Hassan describes the modern or postmodern, exactly, author as a variation on the Orphic myth. Orpheus, the talented musician who had to go on actually singing even after being beheaded. So his head rolling down and going on singing. Donc for Ihab Hassan, this Orphic myth sums up the paradox and the paradoxical position of the postmodern writer and author, how the postmodern author has to go on that he's producing literature even after his death. And the death, of course, of the author now, from Ihab Hassan's perspective, also corresponds. I mean, it's not different from the way Roland Barthes described it, except that Hassan has in mind particular instances of fiction specifically, and of American fiction. Of course, the Orphic, figure does not apply only to postmodern writers, but in Ihab Hassan's work and hypothesis, the Americans have been in a way pioneers in developing the self-awareness about the impossibility of originality, that the authorial aura and the authorial voice has to seek now its meaningfulness elsewhere than in the mythology of originality. And so he used then in the dismemberment of Orpheus the image from Greek mythology of the Orphic, artist who his death is inevitable, but what matters is what he can sing after his death. There is another American, now the other one is more of a theorist, who is Paul de Man. You certainly, the students in particular, I'm referring to students probably who are also in the process of familiarizing with theory. So he developed the equivalent of what Jacques Derrida did in the French theory, donc the method of deconstruction, how to read literature through the deconstructive method. And Paul de Man also, when in some of his writings, insisted on defacement, on the author's writing and even self-writing. Even the writing of autobiography in Paul de Man's argument is necessarily a process of self-defacement, and he refers to the grave. It's as if the authorial voice is actually buried, but it is also resurfacing from the grave, or its echo emerges from the grave. And if you can see in the second quote, vanishing Orpheus leaves behind a lyre without strings, and the moderns inherit it. Their song of silence responds to an ancient sentence with intimations of transcendence. They speak in different tones of silence. Now, it's what is significant in this book also, it's not only the Orphic image that the critic appropriates, but also the way he puts forward then this condition of silence, that authorship from now on will be fatally assimilated to silence. And this is what he would promote later on in a later book when he describes the postmodern turn, how then in this age of uncertainty, especially the uncertainty of originality, of creativity, authorship is bounded then to an inevitable movement, the inevitable movement of literary writing towards silence. And he describes silence as corresponding to all kinds of gaps, of fragmentation, of discontinuity, of the apocalyptic, etc., which the postmodern writers, and according to him, the Americans are leaders in this respect, implement and dramatize. But also part of the paradox, as Ihab Hassan describes it, is that writing is practiced by these postmodern, self-reflexive, metafictional writers. It is practiced as both recognition of an imminent silence, but also an attempt to delay it or to counteract it. And that, especially the best of metafictional writers, of self-reflexive also literature, clearly unveils this painful, in a way, awareness and self-awareness. The other figure, as I said earlier, is John Barth, the novelist, actually in the circle or the category of American experimental writers who emerged from the mid-50s. He's probably one of the most prolific when it comes to theory. In literature too, he's quite prolific, but in theorizing, he wrote many pieces, so mainly two well-known articles, The Literature of Exhaustion in the 60s, and then The Literature of Replenishment, second article. He published it later on because the first one was misunderstood. And in it, in the two articles, as well as in his own extremely self-reflexive fiction, John Barth often appeals directly or indirectly to another myth, to another mythical figure. So when Ihab Hassan then uses the figure or the myth of Orpheus, John Barth uses the figure of Shahrazad, and he describes the position of then the postmodern writer as exactly, similar or more modern version of the situation of Shahrazad, in which, or for whom, storytelling is a matter of survival. In the same way Shahrazad could survive only by allowing her storytelling to go on. So for John Barth, the postmodern writer too, while knowing that he can't come up with anything purely innovative and purely really creative in the classical sense, he or she is doomed, in fact, to carry out the storytelling. Donc he used quite often and appealed to the figure of Shahrazad. But also in the literature of exhaustion, he develops an interesting point when saying that, okay, some of my contemporaries are saying that the novel's time is up now, the novel is going to disappear. It has nothing to offer to its readers anymore. Everything has been covered by the classics from the beginning of the novel and even by earlier forms of narrativity. So for him, there is no need to feel, desperate or depressed by this. So you can simply now go on and write fiction about the impossibility of writing fiction, or write novels about how it is impossible to be creative or innovative in novel writing. So no necessary cause for alarm in this at all. One way to handle such a feeling might be to write a novel about it. And in the same essay, he gives the example of the foundational novel, which is Don Quixote. Donc, he tells us that if we go back to the history of the novel genre, it started with parody, with imitation, right? The novel came into being from the start by imitating other forms. And so it means that from the start, the novel did not claim to be totally or purely original or innovative. And so there is no way now to say that the situation of writers now should be different or more catastrophic. He actually went back to this as well in the literature of replenishment, especially to explain how the first article was not a statement against the legitimacy of authorship and of authorial creation. So in the literature of replenishment, he only made it explicit how now our conception of authorship has to be recast, reshaped within the terms of repetition, of parody, of self-irony, of self-critique, right? So all those, modes of writing that make the author not necessarily quite comfortable. So all those modes of writings that would reflect a form of honesty, a form of faithfulness to the real situation of crisis, to the crisis in originality that all authors had to face and have to face, but it should not function as a kind of block, at least, or as a form of, as a hindering force, at least according to John Barth. Now, before I go to the instances from fiction, I'm going to add to this theoretical and critical picture a few more axes from my own interpretation of what actually made the problematical nature of authorial authority almost a matter of consensus, I mean, among writers. I referred to intertextuality earlier, so it was not only John Roland Barthes who used the argument of a prevailing intertextuality to tell us that because all writing is rewriting, then authorial authority, is no longer relevant or legitimate when we interpret literature. But even later theorists, for example, especially when we come to the area or the axis of theorizing genre, we can see that in the past decades, theorists of genre are increasingly asserting the importance of exchanging the concept of genre for the concept of intertextuality. That even when we deal with theoretical issues of poetics, the paradigm or the concept of intertextuality turns out to be more useful than that of genre, especially now when we see how with classical criticism, genre, the way the concept of genre was used, it was not exclusive of authorial authority. I have just in mind one telling example from Harry James's prefaces. In one of his prefaces, he refers to how an author always brings something, brings an addition to the genre within which he writes his text and within which his texts are recognized and interpreted. So how it is not one-way relation, but that it is a dialectical relationship. In the same way, then the genre, in fact, establishes a map for us in our reading of literature. The creative process allows an author to bring his own touch, his or her own innovative touch. Donc, the concept of genre then used to leave or to create room for the idea or the assumption about creativity and originality. Now, when we see how criticism moved away from the concept of genre and more to the tool, to the device of intertextuality. That is, for them, the concept of intertextuality is more efficient as a device when we tackle issues of literary textuality and meaning, etc. So this contributed in a very significant way to also to problematize, let's say, the issue of representation the issue of authorship. Also, the prevalence of parody from parody is not a recent invention, but the fact that it gradually became prominent in literary production, right from Ulysses in 1922, and then gradually it became more or less the rule, especially when we move towards the postmodern phase. And how we see how parody allowed these writers to develop a sense of self-critique, not only self-reflexivity, but self-critique, how the frequency of the parodic mode allowed the authors themselves to not only to admit their indebtedness and their relatedness to the classics that they imitate, but it allowed them also to define in completely new and different terms the very idea of creative writing. That creative writing is not exclusive of repetition. Creative writing is already and necessarily rooted in what has been done before, in what John Barth calls the déjà vu. So for especially the American writers of John Barth, John Hawkes, Thomas Pynchon, etc., of William Gaddis, so the American writers of this generation then, decided that if I am going inevitably to repeat someone else or many other persons, not only someone else, many other, established texts, so let it do it self-consciously and deliberately. So the prominence of parody was a way of responding positively and creatively also to this reality about the impossibility of originality. So the prominence of parody too allowed these writers not only, as I said, to admit that their creative writing is necessarily repetitive, that it is imitative of the established classics, but it allowed them also to consider, even thematically, the issue and the figure of the author and of authorship, as we will see through the two examples I selected. But parody too also became more or less problematical. Now, when we look at the theorizing, especially the theorizing of parody by the Canadian critic Linda Hudson or by Margaret Rose, so these are actually the iconic or the those who produced the seminal works in the theorizing of parody, we can see how, for example, they avoided or they gave very little space to discuss a peculiar phenomenon in postmodern metafiction, which is self-parody. The fact that the best of the American writers tended to create an internal dialogue between their books, so that the later novel would include an ironic imitation, a subversive imitation of an earlier book of theirs. And this, self-parody and the way it, especially with some writers and with some texts, with some literary texts, becomes an additional layer or facet of problematizing not only the authorship, but even problematizing the death of the author. Because in self-parody, there is a form almost of ironic or subversive self-resurrection, of a way of appealing to the author's own name, to the author's own oeuvre as a kind of intertext. Donc, yes, what can self-irony, self-parody, tell us about then the limits of the authorial death and the limits of what we assume about the inevitable process of repeating and imitating already pre-existing texts. Donc, as I said, the two major critics in their seminal works do not say much about this. And even Richard Poirier, I think, who devoted one part in a book, I think, on self-parody, he approached it from a perspective that does not really shed light to does not shed light on the extent to which self-parody can problematize not the death of the author, but not the authorial authority, but it problematizes even more the death of the author. Right. Yes. Now, to move to two examples from literary creativity, I opted for two, now to remind you of my outline. Here it is. Voila. Two instances in which the parodic mode, the self-reflexivity, the tone of self-critique contribute to not simply making problematical and debatable authorship, but by doing so, they offer the readers a real and quite interesting intellectual challenge. So the first instance is the Book of Daniel by E.L. Doctoroy, and in which we see an example of authorial authority being, debated and perverted in a way in a particular subgenre, a particular form in postmodern metafiction, which is historiographic metafiction. The second instance is taken from the revisited or subverted Kunstlerroman, or what we call the coming-of-age novel, and the illustration would be from Bluebeard by Kurt Vonnegut. So to go to the first instance, which is, or the first, let's say, subgenre or form, historiographic metafiction. Probably, sure, certainly, that this was coined by Linda Hutchon in Poetics of Postmodernism. And the category turned to be quite significant sometimes in ways that were not intended by Hutchon herself, but the category globally then refers to those novels that seem to be historical novels or that approximate historical novels, but they do so within an extremely subversive mode of writing. And subversive also technical choices. So there is something of, or a component of history. There is also, even in form, a structure that reminds us of the classical historical novel, but with a major and substantial difference. What I find relevant in Hutchon's approach also, as you can see in the second quotation, is her insistence on the fact that historiographic metafiction, the way we can read it or grasp it in a particular text, implements parody and recognizes intertextuality. So its major mode is that of intertextual parody. And she says this intertextual parody of historiographic metafiction offers a sense of the presence of the past, but it is a past that can be known only through or from its texts, its traces. So what we can sum up from, the theorizing, Hutchins' theorizing of historiographic metafiction, is that especially what makes it different from the historical novel is that it reminds its reader of the textuality and narrativity of historiography. Historiographic metafiction uses intertextual patterns to raise questions about the nature of events and of their textual representation. So it does not use history or historiography as a background or as context or as material that it simply fictionalizes. It uses historiography as intertext in the sense that the novel or the metafictional text puts into question the credibility of historiography, points and reminds us continuously, as Dr. Roy does in the book of Daniel, of the fact that historiography does not escape the rules of narrativity and textuality and discursivity, which are applied or which are implemented in fiction and in literature. Of course, the result is not to end up creating an equation. The result is not to simply say that, okay, historiography equals fiction. No. So what the interest intellectually and conceptually of historiographic metafiction is that it urges us actually to make sense of the text continuously within the terms of the tension, within the terms of the paradoxical tension between the discursive constructs of imaginative literature, like fiction, and the similar operation of discursive, stylistic, narrative methods, etc., in the discourse of historiography. Why am I appealing to this form, to this particular form of experimental fiction in the American, postmodern literary scene? Why? Because historiographic metafiction, in fact, seems to be seeking the authorial authority or revival of authorial authority by challenging the authority of historiography. So it does not say that, okay, fiction is better or fiction is more credible. No. But it tries, at least with the best examples, it tries to find, room for authorial voice and maybe innovation, but innovation only at the level of the critical outlook, at the level of critical and conceptual thinking, not at the level of coming up with a story that no one invented before. Right? So challenging the authority of historiography is what Dr. Roy is doing in the book of Daniel. But there is an additional also thematic axis, which is extremely interesting with regard to authorship in the book of Daniel, which is an implicit struggle with the idea of commitment. Now, when an author is said to be committed, not necessarily to one cause, so commitment, so we move to the area of politics, but even to a sense of justice. Now, for those who did not read the novel, the book of Daniel is told in the form of a diary or different forms of self-writing. So the protagonist, Daniel, is the son of the Isaac's couple of Americans, Jewish Americans, who were sentenced to death and executed in the McCarthyist time on the accusation that they were transmitting secrets, atomic secrets, to the Soviet Union. So these actions, of course, it's easy to guess that they were shaped on the historical model of the Rosenbergs, the couple of the Rosenbergs who were then accused of espionage, of serving then the Soviet intelligence. And their case, of course, remained more or less shocking and traumatic in the collective American imagination, because they were probably the only couple to be actually executed. Well, some historical accounts say that the guilt of the wife was not fully established, and yet in that fever of the McCarthyist paranoia, then, the judges preferred maybe to execute or to sentence the two individuals to death. So in Dr. Roy's novel, Daniel is their son, the son of the Isaksons, who is now a young scholar, an adult, married, and young scholar working in the library on his doctoral dissertation. And the topic of his doctoral dissertation is to reinvestigate the case of his parents' guilt in order to see whether they were actually guilty of what they were accused of or not. And in his writing, donc, the text takes the form more of a diary, or also an ongoing process that emerges from a written text emerging from Daniel's pen. Daniel finds himself thinking about history and about historical cases of similar, tragic events like the Moscow trials at the time of Stalin, which were similar to the trial of his parents, thinking also and rewriting particular instances of national and international history. Donc, the protagonist finds himself actually too much immersed in rethinking of history and historiography, and whether not only whether it to be trusted, but also what does it mean to for one to take for granted or to accept, we see, the content of historiography. I will point to the issue of commitment later on, because right. Yes, hopefully I won't forget to refer to also point even briefly to the question of commitment. Why? Because Daniel, in the book of Daniel, is a leftist, so young scholar, and he's also ideologically speaking a leftist, and he was brought up by two communist parents. So his parents were communists, but their guilt when it comes to the accusation of espionage was never clearly established. And Dr. Roy, too, was a socialist. And in one of the interviews, says that that his Dr. Roy he's a new leftist, and that through Daniel, he was himself struggling with the borderline, actually, between being faithful to one's conception of things, to one's understanding of things, and the kind of also a faithfulness to one's ideology, to one's ideological outlook. That an author is required to transmit. And yes, I will come back to that, but for the moment we need to stop. I picked up two quotations which, when we read the novel, actually sum up much of the dilemma that the book of Daniel raises around historiography. And as I said earlier, remember, for Daniel, when he reconsiders his historiography and when he meditates on the different discourses, maneuvers, and manipulative rhetoric of historiography, he's guided, in fact, by his own book project. So Daniel is also a potential or an emerging author. except that at the beginning of the novel, he's in the process of writing a doctoral dissertation. But towards the end of the novel, he feels relieved and much more comfortable with the idea of turning his manuscript into a novel, or presenting his manuscript to his reader as a novel. So that kind of tour de force at the end, which is part of the novel's irony, in fact, allows the book to suggest to the reader that maybe the only way out of the dilemma of historiography for an author is to be satisfied with literature. The first quote, it's when Daniel sums up the whole fever of mass media after his parents were arrested. How then on television, on the radio, in newspapers, there was a proliferation of stories about the parents, his actions, and of their guilt, and so on and so forth. So while our life is shrinking, he says, another existence, another dimension expands its image and amplifies its voices. In this new dimension of life, we are spread into headlines and news broadcasts. Our troops are being captured and killed. Of course, the sarcasm in our troops are being captured and killed. It means that, the mass media and the soi-disant, the neutral investigations amplified so much the danger or the threat supposedly incarnated by Daniel's parents, that a whole army, was attributed to them, or something like an army was attributed to them. This means also that Daniel's own text had continuously, so the text that we are reading in the novel, competes with journalistic and media accounts of the parents' guilt of conspiracy. And we see Daniel reporting and inserting some of those media stories, right, in order to show us how the factual discourse of journalism, the kind of newspaper articles which will become archival documents for the historian later on, at least in part, they would be used as archival documents, how then the factual discourse of newspapers, of mass media is already permeated with the fictitious element, right? Donc, he sees then his own text as not only competing, but also his authorial self as already entrapped in this, overwhelming number of discourses created about his own topic, that is the guilt of his parents, and how his own writing has to be, in the first place, a way of resisting or counteracting those journalistic discourses that were offered to the audience as factual, to show us that all the danger comes from the discourse that offers itself to its audience as purely factual. In another instance, the second one, Daniel, here, the quote taken from page 78, Daniel here sums up how he was brought up by his communist father, how his father was extremely attentive to the suffering of the working class in America and elsewhere, and how he was teaching his kid, his son, Daniel, what he himself was conscious of, how he was trying to promote a particular understanding of history in his son. But this ended up producing something problematical, as we will see. So he says, putting together, so this is what the father was doing, when he was repeatedly telling his son about the evil of capitalism, the suffering of the working class, etc., etc., putting together all the historic injustices and showing me the pattern and how everything that had happened was inevitable according to the Marxian analysis, putting it all together. Now, this is an expression that keeps coming back and time and again in the narrative. When in its own context, that is in the context of the whole narrative, we see actually Daniel getting caught up in a dilemma. Part of the dilemma has to do with, now, if we were to understand historiography as a pattern of interrelated events, or events that are guided by a certain causality, how different is this from the conspiracy theory? So Daniel knows that this is how also we judge people as insane when they think of that everything is connected, and that so at the end what happens is a conspiracy. So for him, this understanding of historiography also borders the problematical then area of conspiracy theory. And of course, in the cultural code, conspiracy theory is often perceived as an indication of insanity or irrationality in an individual's that is in an individual's conception of things, right? Later on also, we see Daniel accumulating the information, right? So things about facts, so the information about what actually happened, whether in America, in the Soviet Union, here and there, and we have pieces of encyclopedic information, but all this leads him to the bitter then discovery that the accumulation of information does not produce the historical truth, that the historical truth he is seeking, he is after, cannot correspond to the sum total of the accumulated information. And to my sense, this is one of the most significant aspects of the novel. And this is what, I mean, it is this inaccessibility or impossibility of the historical truth that leads Daniel to abandon his initial project altogether and to seek a form of satisfaction, even limited satisfaction, with the idea, with the prospect of turning his text into fiction, into a novel. So through the experience of Daniel, then Dr. Roy dramatizes then one instance of authorial struggle with historiography, how historiography cannot be trusted at 100% to establish the aura or the authority of historical fiction, how now the author, the postmodern author, if you wish, can seek his credibility and his legitimacy only by indulging in a substantial critique and in a disillusioned decoding of the discourses of historiography. He won't, in this case, reach the historical truth, but what matters, of course, is the disillusionment itself. I mean, what is valuable is the disillusionment itself. Also, in the novel, as I said, Daniel often refers to his ideology as a leftist, which is a variation on Dr. Roy's own leftist stance, ideologically speaking. Pardon. And it's interesting to see how for Dr. Roy, authorial legitimacy has to do or is inclusive also of a minimal sense of commitment. right? You cannot only write about aesthetic topics, that the writer's involvement in the real world, in the world of politics, of cultural and historical processes, of course, is or has to be displayed in promoting or developing, even in critical terms, a degree of commitment, not necessarily commitment to the leftist ideology, right? But the kind of ideals, probably commitment to the ideals that the leftist ideology usually, puts forward or formulates, like justice or more justice, let's say, less exploitation of people. Yes, less or containing the excesses of capitalism, and so on and so forth. Now, the next text, which is an instance of the Kunstlerroman, as I said, or what we call the novel, the coming of age novel. By the way, in her first book, Linda Hudson refers to this novelistic form of the Kunstlerroman, the fact that it gained momentum in the 20th century, and she used the argument that this is an instance of why metafiction has become so prominent. So we can think of examples like A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, among others, to stand for this category. But I think personally that it's not the maybe classical or the, peaceful, between inverted commas, peaceful intellectually speaking, that is, version of the Kunstlerroman that gives us the most interesting conceptualizing of authorship. I think it's more those ironic, subversive revisiting of the Kunstlerroman that actually are capable of, and they did, at least the few examples I'm familiar with, give back or bring back the issue of authorship to the debate. What is different now in tone between Vonnegut, Bluebeard, this is the book I'm referring to, Bluebeard. What makes it different from, for example, the Book of Daniel? The Book of Daniel remains mostly ironic, so relying in highlighting all the problematical issues related to the legitimacy and the possibility and the scope of authorship within the subtlety of irony and self-irony. In Bluebeard by Vonnegut, at the level of tone, there is a radical move, a move towards the tone of derision. And so the problematizing of authorship becomes even more emphatic and more interesting. Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Tended actually to produce different fictional versions of the author. In the best of his novels, not only in Bluebeard, but the best of his novels, we do have the figure of either the narrator who is in the process of writing a book, or the narrator who is a confirmed author, etc. Donc he has this, idiosyncratic feature of then inventing and reinventing the figure of the author within the fictional construct of his narratives. In Bluebeard, which was published in 1987, and which also takes the form of two parallel texts, two parallel written texts. So the protagonist, who is an American painter of Armenian origins, Ray Bukarabakian, his name, is in the process of writing his autobiography. Donc, the text begins as an autobiography, but soon he creates a parallel narrative, which is a diary. And he was urged to keep a diary by his female neighbor and friend, Cersei Berman, her name, who was continuously spying on him and spying on his typewriter and trying to read behind his back what he was writing. So I just allow the audience to read. This is the very opening of it. You can see already the tone of self-derision. Donc, this is how Bluebeard begins. Having written the end to this story of my life, I find it more prudent to scamper back here to before the beginning. I promised you an autobiography, but something went wrong in the kitchen. It turned out to be a diary. We can always send out for pizza if necessary. So he gets lost in his own even metaphor of the kitchen. Now, the derision in this novel, or the authorial self-derision, is mostly related to the failure of control. So Reibo Karabakian is tries to manipulate public media, etc., to create his own aura and his own authorial image. Also, the novel, even though it deals with the world of painting, debates the question of mimetic art, whether art can now survive as within the mimetic practice, and an author, or be it painter or writer, is it possible for an author to then build a public-like image by simply carrying out the same old tradition of mimetic art or not? And of course, as I said, the novel is extremely self-ironic and promotes basically that sense of self-derision. Bien. Sorry, I have to go back to right. Yes, there is even in the novel further problematizing of the authorial image in the way Kurt Vonnegut actually plays with what we call the narrative borders. And it's not the only novel in which he does this, but in Bluebeard, for example, he makes the statement under the title of author's note that Reibo Karabakian never lived, and that the novel is a history of nothing but his own idiosyncratic response. But then immediately after it comes Reibo's own dedication of the book. This book is for Cersei Berman. What else can I say? Donc, the doubleness of the authorial notes, which are presented under the same heading, right, of author's note, is or corresponds to Vonnegut's own way of teasing us about where does the fiction begin. So that Vonnegut himself appears as competing with his own creation, competing with his own fictional author. Now, I made some points about deductions with regard to historiographic metafiction and the Kunstler roman. Donc, the authorial theme in historiographic metafiction is recast with a critical rethinking of the nature of writing and representation. Donc, it is mostly related to that, the questioning of writing and the questioning of representation. Questioning the authority of historiography guides the process of literary writing. So this is about historiographic metafiction. Seeking room for creativity in the paradox of appealing to and perverting the authority of historiography. For the Kunstler roman, then, the subversive version of the coming-of-age novel takes the ethos of self-critique to the point of self-derision. Fictionalizing the authorial figure is a thematic choice that raises questions about authorial authority more than it offers answers, dramatizing the problematical nature of the narrative borders, so the overlapping authorial voices, historical and fictional, bestows then an ontological dimension on the critical revision of the authorial concept. Also, the tone of self-derision is part of the metafictional text's attempt to resist the logic of readerly consumption, thanks to the sense of bewilderment and indeterminacy with which the text concludes. So, bringing back then the debate and the tension around authorial aura, albeit within the terms of self-irony and self-critique, have mandated a rethinking of authorial authority as a textual layer or component that attests to a performed sincerity. So there is something ethical in it. The whole then game of hide and seek with the author's own status as an author, then, at least has the merit of offering the reader a performed form of sincere literary writing. Even as authorial authority is revoked through the prevailing modes of parody and self-irony, it remains an authorial gesture that counteracts any totalizing tendency in the interpretive process. This is the second ethical implication. As a performed ethical gesture, then, the parodic mode of literary self-reflexivity displayed by American fiction brings the unveiling of the radical openness of literary or narrative constructs to problematizing the Foucauldian author function, but not its disappearance. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience and listening. Yes, I'm done.
Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Elounelli. And we would like to thank you for your detailed and intriguing talk. And because of shortage of time, we'll have a couple of questions, right?
Yes, okay.
Okay. Yes. Do you have any questions, comments? Okay. Yes, Brian. Your microphone is off.
Yep.
Okay.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Solana, for your talk, and it's quite interesting. And I just had a quick question about Kurt Vonnegut and maybe some other authors that tend to kind of insert themselves into the narrative. And I'm thinking of like Philip Roth and even Richard Powers, who also does this. And I was curious on when authors insert themselves into the text or to the narrative, even obviously like Roth and Vonnegut do in playful ways. I wonder how that impacts the way that you've theorized authorship. And I was curious if you had some thoughts on that one.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Actually, the example you mentioned, Roth, like in The Ghostwriter, for example, or in more interesting examples. Yes, I mean, there are two tendencies. There are at least two tendencies. So there are those who yes, insert themselves, as you said. So they indulge in that game of self-fictionalizing in a way that does not necessarily problematize authorship, conceptually speaking. Donc, I'm thinking of Roth, for example. So even if there is a problematical issue raised, it's more in relation to culture, donc the one who chooses to write on behalf of another or something like that. But conceptually, I think the text that genuinely challenge the concept, and allow us to think about, yes, its scope, about the legitimacy, etc., are those that do it, that is fictionalize the authorial figure, but within extremely destabilizing and problematizing terms, so that the fictional author himself is not to be trusted. For example, we see that there is a lot of dramatic irony produced at the expense of the fictional author, that he betrays some kind of inconsistency, or betrays a naive belief in something, as with Vonnegut, for example, Reibo Karabakian. Donc he was really the enemy of realism, and he built all his aura on abstract expressionism, that he was one of the icons of abstract impressionism. But when his locked room was finally, it's where he keeps his secret. This is why he calls himself Bluebeard. When the locked room was open, they discovered that his only work was a piece of realistic painting, that it was one of the most banal, kind of. Donc those texts that really do not simply glorify the authorial image, or at least do not simply problematize occasional situations, as with the ghostwriter, for example, in relation to politics and to, but rather challenge our conception of, of the author, that is per se, right? Donc they do not all produce the same way, and. One basic difficulty of the two tendencies too is that the first one, like the one incarnated by at least one work by Philip Roth, offer themselves quite easily to commercial cinema, or to forms of commodification, that is, right? So when they are adapted to the cinema, so it is part of commercial, consumed movies, while the other one, even when it is adapted, in cinematography, there is something in the text, or in the questioning and aspect, in the aspect of indeterminacy in the text, which resists commodification. So we cannot read this kind of text, comfortably, and we are simply consuming it. We keep thinking with it. Continuously, and even after we finish.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. It seems that someone, I think, wrote something in the, no.
Yes, that was a thank you message, Saloua.
Yes, I noticed.
Okay. Do we have any other questions, comments, remarks? I guess no. I take it as a no. Okay. So it was great to have you, Saloua. Thank you very much. It was also very nice to meet you in Izmir in our conference. We hope to meet you again, both in person and in our online meetings. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for being here. And yes, hopefully we will meet in one of the future events of the association.
Thank you
to which I wish the best of luck.
Yeah. Thank you very much. See
Thank
you
you all.
and see you all.
Thank you very
Yes.
much.
Bye-bye.
Professor,
Bye-bye.
thank you very much. We will, with your permission, of course, we will also upload this on YouTube, if you don't
Yes,
mind.
yes. No problem at all.
It
And
will be on YouTube sometime in next week.
yes, okay, no
And
problem.
we'll post you the link. Thank you very much.
D'accord, thank you. And if any of the students would like to have a text, I mean, the written copy of the text, I will be happy to send it to the ASAT members and, I mean, just in case.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you, Deborah, who is with us here. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Deborah,
Professor.
for joining us.
Thank you and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Have a nice evening. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
And thanks to all the participants as well.
Yes, all of them.